Have you ever strolled through an old neighborhood or wandered the cobbled streets of a historic district and noticed something odd? A strange mark carved into a building, a deliberate gouge in the stone, or a symbol scratched where it doesn't seem to belong. At first glance, these might look like random acts of vandalism or the wear and tear of time, but look closer and you'll realize these aren't accidents. They're ceremonial scars, silent testimonies etched into the very bones of our cities, each one a coded message from the past. These architectural wounds tell stories of rebellion, defiance, and moments when ordinary people left their mark on history in extraordinary ways. Picture this, a centuries-old cathedral with a single, jagged line cut deep into its facade. To the untrained eye, it's just damage, but to those who know how to read these scars, it's a bold declaration, a protest frozen in stone. Across the world, from ancient temples to colonial buildings, these markings serve as hidden diaries of civil unrest. They're the fingerprints of uprisings, the graffiti of revolutions, and sometimes the last whispers of forgotten struggles. And the most astonishing part, they're everywhere, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to piece together their secrets. Today, we're going on a journey to uncover 28 of these remarkable scars, each one a window into a pivotal moment when architecture became more than just brick and mortar. It became a canvas for human emotion. We'll explore how a simple chip in a statue's pedestal might reveal a failed rebellion, or how a series of grooves in a palace wall could trace the rise and fall of an empire. By the time we're done, you'll never look at the buildings around you the same way again, because these scars aren't just marks on stone, they're echoes of the past, urging us to remember. So let's step into the shadows of history and listen to what these walls have been trying to tell us all along. Long before spray paint or digital activism, people found ways to make their voices heard in the most permanent way possible, by marking the world around them. These ceremonial scars weren't just vandalism, they were calculated, symbolic acts, often tied to deep cultural or political meaning. Take medieval Europe, where a noble's coat of arms wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration of power. Scratching it out or defacing it wasn't just mischief, it was an act of rebellion, a way for the powerless to say, "You don't own us." The punishment for such defiance could be severe, but that only made the act more powerful. Across the ocean, indigenous cultures used similar methods to resist colonization. Sacred sites, already rich with spiritual meaning, became canvases for coded messages of resistance. A single line carved into a temple wall might look like wear and tear to outsiders, but to the community, it could mark the date of an uprising or honor a fallen leader. These scars weren't just about destruction, they were about preservation, ensuring that even if history was written by the victors, the truth would still be etched in stone. What's fascinating is how universal this practice became. From the chipped corners of statues in ancient Rome, where emperors' faces were defaced after their fall, to the deliberate notches left in colonial buildings by enslaved laborers, these marks were never random. They were carefully placed like hidden signatures in the margins of history, and while the tools and techniques varied, chisels, knives, even fire, the intent was the same, to leave a mark that couldn't be erased. Because when words are silenced, stone still speaks, these early scars set the stage for everything that followed. They prove that architecture isn't just about shelter or beauty, it's a living record of human struggle. Every chip, every groove, every deliberate flaw tells us something about the people who left it behind. They weren't just building structures, they were sending messages to the future. And now, centuries later, we're finally learning how to read them. The French Revolution didn't just unfold in speeches and pamphlets, it was carved into the very walls of Paris. Walk through the city today, and if you know where to look, you'll find the ghostly outlines where fleurs de lis once adorned the gates of royal palaces. These weren't haphazard acts of destruction, they were surgical strikes against symbols of power. The mobs didn't just topple statues, they meticulously chiseled away every trace of the monarchy's heraldry, leaving behind hollowed-out stone where crowns and coats of arms had once proclaimed divine right. What's remarkable is the precision. This wasn't blind rage, it was a calculated rewriting of history in real time, turning architecture into a revolutionary manifesto. Across the Atlantic, the same phenomenon played out during the American Revolution, but with a distinctly colonial twist. Loyalists' mansions, those grand homes with British crests above their doorways, became targets. Patriots would scrape away these emblems not just to punish, but to send a message. The old order was literally being erased from the landscape. Some homeowners, fearing retaliation, preemptively removed their own insignias, leaving odd blank patches in the brickwork that still puzzle historians today. These silent edits tell us something profound about revolutions. They are as much about destroying symbols as they are about creating new ones. But here's what makes these scars different from ordinary vandalism. The chisel marks often follow the original contours of the removed symbols with eerie accuracy, suggesting the defacers weren't just rebels. They were artisans, perhaps even the same stonemasons who'd originally carved those royal motifs. Imagine the irony: craftsmen once paid to glorify the monarchy, now using their skills to undo their own work. This duality gives these scars their weight. They're not just acts of rebellion, they're transformations where the tools of creation become instruments of erasure. And that's why these markings endure, not as wounds, but as proof that stone can be as fluid as history itself. The real lesson lies in the aftermath. After the revolutions, many of these defaced buildings were left unrepaired, not because people forgot, but because they remembered. Those empty spaces where royalty once sat became permanent reminders of change. Officials could have easily patched the damage, but they chose to let the scars speak. That decision turned architecture into something far more powerful than decoration. It became a living monument to the idea that no power is set in stone. Prison walls have a way of holding stories that history books often overlook. While official records might document dates and crimes, the true voices of the past, raw, unfiltered, and achingly human, are found in the scratches and carvings left behind by those who were locked away. Take the Bastille, for instance. Before it became a symbol of revolution, its cells held political dissidents who passed the endless hours by etching their frustrations into the stone. These marks weren't just idle doodles, they were acts of defiance, a way to assert humanity in a place designed to strip it away. In Ireland's Kilmainham jail, the weight of history feels especially heavy. Here, rebels sentenced to execution during the 1916 Easter Rising left behind final messages, some to loved ones, others to the cause they were dying for. One inscription, barely visible now, reads simply, Buanad and Foblacht, Irish for Long Live the Republic. It's a whisper from the past, a last stand carved into the walls by hands that knew they'd never see freedom again. These scars aren't just historical artifacts, they're heartbeats frozen in time, reminders that even in the darkest corners, people found ways to be heard. Alcatraz, often remembered for its notorious criminals, holds quieter but equally powerful marks. Native American activists imprisoned during the 1970s occupation left symbols of their resistance: a feather, a sun, a broken chain hidden in the recesses of their cells. These carvings weren't just personal, they were part of a larger story, a thread connecting generations of struggle. unlike graffiti in public spaces, prison etchings carry an extra layer of urgency. Every stroke of a makeshift tool was a risk, a rebellion against silence. What makes these scars so compelling is their intimacy. They weren't meant for crowds or cameras. They were private acts of courage, often done in stolen moments. A name, a date, a plea, each one a small but unyielding refusal to disappear. Today, when we run our fingers over these grooves, we're not just touching stone. We're touching the defiance of someone who refused to let their story end with a locked door. And that's the power of these scars. They force us to ask, if walls could scream, what would they tell us? Religious buildings were never just places of worship. They were battlegrounds where faith and power clashed in the most visible way possible. Take the Protestant Reformation, when churches across Europe became stages for dramatic acts of iconoclasm. Saint statues lost their heads not by accident but with deliberate precision. Paintings of miracles were scrubbed away until only ghostly outlines remained. This wasn't random destruction, it was a theological statement carved into the walls themselves. The reformers believed sacred art distracted from true worship, so they didn't just remove it, they made sure its absence became part of the building's story. Walk into an old Dutch church today, and you'll see patches of blank plaster where vibrant frescoes once told biblical tales. Those empty spaces are scars, to a different kind of mark, where what's missing speaks louder than what remains. Half a world away, the same patterns emerged under vastly different circumstances. When Mughal emperors expanded their rule across India, they often repurposed Hindu temples, chiseling away deities' faces and overlaying Islamic calligraphy. But the story doesn't end there. Centuries later, as political tides turned, Hindu rulers meticulously restored many of these sites, carefully uncovering original carvings that had been plastered over. The layers tell a story of back and forth struggle, where each generation left its mark, sometimes literally, on the sacred spaces of the past. What's fascinating is how these acts mirrored one another across cultures. Whether it was whitewash covering Catholic saints or lime plaster obscuring Hindu gods, the method was the same, not just destruction but transformation. Yet these scars hold a paradox. While they began as acts of conquest, many have since taken on new meaning. In Spain's Great Mosque of Cordoba, Christian altars stand surrounded by Islamic arches, an architectural palimpsest where neither faith fully erased the other. Visitors today don't see just conflict in these layered walls. They see centuries of devotion piling up like strata in stone. That's the unexpected legacy of religious iconoclasm. What started as attempts to silence one tradition often ended up preserving it in the most indelible way possible, not in books or memory, but in the very bones of buildings that refuse to forget. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the craftsmanship. Whether it's a medieval cathedral or a southern Indian temple, the defacing was often done with surprising care. Conquerors might smash a statue's nose to blind it spiritually, or remove hands to symbolize broken power, ritualized acts following ancient rules. Even in violence, there was a strange reverence, as if those wielding the chisels understood they weren't just breaking stone, but engaging in a dialogue across time. That's why these scars still move us today. They're not just wounds, they're conversations frozen in architecture, where every chip and erasure asks us to reckon with how belief can both divide and endure. Colonization didn't just rewrite history, it etched itself into the landscape, layer by layer, stone by stone. But what happens when the conquered push back? In Mexico City, the story is literally buried beneath your feet. When Spanish conquistadors built their grand cathedral over the ruins of the Aztec Templo Mayor, they didn't realize they were creating a time capsule. Centuries later, renovations revealed something astonishing. Original Aztec carvings, untouched, hidden like secret messages beneath the altar. These weren't just archaeological finds, they were acts of quiet defiance. Indigenous laborers, forced to build the very churches that symbolized their oppression, had carefully preserved fragments of their culture in the foundations. A serpent's head here, a calendar glyph there, each one a whispered rebellion, ensuring their ancestors' voices would someday resurface. Halfway across the world, a different kind of scar tells a similar story. In Senegal, the French colonial administration erected statues of generals and governors, their stone eyes gazing imperiously over the people they ruled. But when independence swept through Africa in the mid-20th century, those statues didn't just come down, they were transformed. Some were decapitated, their heads rolling through the streets in symbolic trials. Others had their faces meticulously chiseled away, leaving eerie, featureless silhouettes where European pride once stood. These weren't acts of chaos, they were carefully staged performances of justice, turning monuments of oppression into theaters of reckoning. The empty plinths that remain aren't accidents, they're intentional scars, reminders that no empire gets to write the final chapter. What makes these marks so powerful is their duality. They're both destruction and creation, raising one narrative to make space for another. In India, British colonial buildings were splashed with red dye during protests, mimicking the blood spilled under imperial rule. In the Philippines, Spanish-era churches bear faint scratches where revolutionaries pried off royal crests, replacing them with indigenous motifs. Even the tools used tell a story. Chisels that once carved colonial coats of arms were repurposed to undo them, turning the master's tools against the master's house. But here's the twist: sometimes the scars themselves become sacred. In Oaxaca, a Spanish church wall displays a pre-Hispanic glyph that was never fully concealed. Locals now touch it for blessings, blending Catholic and indigenous traditions into something entirely new. That's the true power of these marks. They don't just erase, they reinterpret. A defaced statue isn't just a broken artifact, it's a canvas where new meanings are born. And that's why colonial scars endure. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history isn't set in stone. It's a conversation, one that's still being carved, chip by chip, into the walls around us. Machines weren't just tools of production during the Industrial Revolution. They became unwitting scribes, recording the frustrations of those who operated them. In the textile mills of 19th century England, where deafening looms drowned out voices, workers found a way to make themselves heard. Beneath the clatter of machinery, they'd scratch messages into the metal frames, complaints about wages, curses against foremen, even crude drawings of nooses to symbolize their desperation. These weren't idle marks, they were SOS signals from the industrial underworld, left by fingers that knew they might never see better days. Cross the Atlantic to Pennsylvania's coal country, and the scars take on an even darker tone. Miners, descending daily into literal darkness, used their picks to carve dates and names into the soft shale walls, not as graffiti, but as breadcrumbs. If a shaft collapsed, these markings helped rescuers know where to dig. But alongside practical notes, they left other symbols: crossed tools signaling strikes, stick figures with raised fists, even the occasional hymn lyric about deliverance. The coal itself became their parchment, absorbing both their labor and their defiance. What makes these industrial scars so haunting is their duality. A single groove in a Manchester loom might record both the workers' anger and their resignation, the metal worn smooth by countless passes of the same frustrated finger. In Lowell, Massachusetts, young mill girls etched poetry between the gears, transforming factory equipment into accidental diaries. The most poignant marks are those that blend the personal with the political. a child's handprint in mine dust beside the words 12 hours today, or a weaving machine signed Mary Wilkins, aged 14. These weren't just protests, they were proof of existence. Before unions had meeting halls or strikes made newspapers, the workers' movement lived in these subtle rebellions of steel and stone. And while factory owners whitewashed walls or replaced equipment, they couldn't erase every mark. Today, preservationists sometimes uncover these hidden messages during renovations. A single defiant word peeking through layers of industrial paint, or a miner's tally of unpaid hours preserved in perfect darkness. The true power of these scars lies in their quiet persistence. Unlike fiery speeches or banner headlines, they didn't demand attention, they waited for it. And now, when we press our ears to these cold metal surfaces, we can almost hear the echoes of spinning wheels and pickaxes, still whispering the same truth, that every economic revolution leaves its marks not just in ledgers, but in the very bones of the buildings where history's invisible hands labored. War reshapes cities in ways that go far beyond rubble and reconstruction. Some wounds are left deliberately unhealed, not from neglect, but as powerful statements etched in brick and mortar. Take Berlin's Museum Island, where the columns of the old museum still bear the pockmarks of World War II gunfire. These aren't overlooked damages, they're carefully preserved, each crater a punctuation mark in the story of the city's survival. The bullet holes follow precise patterns, tracing the trajectories of street-to-street combat like a grim choreography frozen in time. What's remarkable is the intentionality behind these scars. After the war, restoration teams could have easily filled them in, but instead they became part of the building's new identity. The message is clear: some memories are too important to plaster over. Sarajevo takes this idea even further. Walk through the city center today, and you'll encounter buildings that look frozen in the early 1990s, their facades shredded by sniper fire, their walls gouged by mortar shells. These aren't abandoned ruins, they're curated witnesses to the 1400-day siege that defined a generation. The Holiday Inn, once a haven for journalists during the Bosnian War, still wears its distinctive yellow panels, now punctuated by gaping wounds where artillery struck. Locals call these scars the Roses of Sarajevo, a poetic name for something so violent. The contrast is striking, vibrant city life humming around these preserved pockets of damage, as if time itself split into parallel tracks. What makes these war scars different from ordinary battle damage is their transformation into active memorials. In Warsaw, fragments of the ghetto walls stand amid modern apartments, their rough edges untouched. In Beirut, the Holiday Inn tower remains a hollowed-out skeleton, its missing windows like empty eye sockets staring across a city that moved on. These structures serve a dual purpose. They honor the past while challenging the present. A bullet-riddled wall isn't just a relic, it's a question posed to every passerby. What have we learned? The most profound lesson lies in the craftsmanship of preservation. Maintaining these scars often requires more effort than repairing them. In Berlin, conservators use special techniques to stabilize crumbling edges without obscuring the original damage. In Croatia's coastal cities, buildings hit by naval bombardments have been structurally reinforced while keeping their shattered balconies and sheared-off corners intact. This painstaking work reveals an ironic truth. Sometimes the greatest respect we can pay to history is to let its wounds remain visible, because these buildings aren't just reminders of what was lost, they're proof of what endured. Perhaps the most powerful example sits quietly in Hiroshima. The atomic bomb dome, its skeletal frame preserved exactly as the blast left it, doesn't just memorialize tragedy, it frames hope. The ruins stand surrounded by a thriving city, a living testament to resilience. That's the unspoken power of these architectural scars. They don't let us turn away from darkness, but they also refuse to let darkness have the final word. Every preserved crack, every unrestored crater becomes a bridge between memory and renewal, asking us to carry the past forward without being trapped by it. Hidden in plain sight, some of history's most fascinating scars aren't shouts of rebellion, they're whispers of secrecy. Take a stroll through Rome's ancient streets, and you might notice a strange symbol scratched above a doorway, a simple fish, barely noticeable unless you know to look. To most, it's just weathering or a mason's mark, but 2,000 years ago, that fish was a lifeline, a covert signal marking safe houses where persecuted Christians could worship without fear. These weren't random doodles, they were meticulously placed, part of an underground language where architecture became a map for the hunted. The tradition of clandestine markings stretches far beyond religious persecution. In 18th century Europe, Freemasons left their own coded signatures on buildings. A compass here, a square there, subtly worked into the stonework of cathedrals and civic halls. These weren't just decorative flourishes, they were breadcrumbs for fellow members, pointing the way to meeting places or signaling alliances. Even today, historians debate whether certain carvings on Paris's Notre Dame are medieval craftsmanship or Masonic messages layered into the restoration. That's the genius of these scars, their ambiguity. They could pass as artistry to the untrained eye while screaming their true meaning to initiates. Anarchists took this idea even further. In late 19th century Barcelona, a single circled, chiseled into a lamppost might mark a drop point for revolutionary literature. In Vienna, the faint outline of a black cat on a tavern's beam signaled a haven for radicals on the run. Unlike grand public monuments, these marks were designed to evade authority, small enough to overlook, significant enough to guide those in the know. The real power lay in their subtlety. A government could tear down a poster or ban a pamphlet, but how do you erase a shadow, a scratch, a barely their indentation in stone? What makes these scars so compelling is their duality. They're both practical tools and profound statements about resistance. In colonial India, nationalist groups used temple carvings to hide maps of British troop movements, sacred geometry, doubling as military intelligence. During the American Underground Railroad, quilts hung from windows might guide escaping enslaved people, but so could specific notches on fence posts or the arrangement of bricks in a chimney. These weren't just signals, they were acts of trust, a way to say, "You're safe here," without uttering a word. The most astonishing examples emerge when these hidden languages collide. In Prague, a single building might bear layers of secret scars. Medieval alchemist symbols overlaid with Hussite rebellion codes, later defaced by communist censors, then reclaimed by Velvet Revolution graffiti artists. Each generation left its mark, not by destroying the previous one, but by weaving into it, creating a palimpsest of dissent. That's the true legacy of these coded scars. They remind us that even in the most surveilled spaces, people find ways to speak, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, stubborn act of leaving a mark only the right eyes will see. Perhaps the most poignant detail lies in the craftsmanship. Many of these symbols were carved with painstaking precision, often by artisans who risked everything to make them. A Masonic square might be perfectly aligned with a window's shadow at noon. A Christian fish could follow the natural grain of the stone, making it seem to appear and disappear with the light. This wasn't just hiding, it was an art form, a way to embed meaning so deeply into architecture that it became inseparable from the structure itself. And that's why these scars endure. They're not just historical footnotes, they're masterclasses in how the powerless can turn the walls of the powerful into their own clandestine canvas. There's something uniquely powerful about the way student protests etch themselves into the walls of universities' places meant to mold young minds into the establishment, only to become canvases for dismantling it. Take the Sorbonne in May 1968, where the cobblestones themselves were ripped up for barricades, but the real revolution was scribbled in paint and chalk across lecture hall walls. "Be realistic, demand the impossible," screamed one slogan, its letters dripping like molten defiance. These weren't random acts of vandalism, they were carefully curated manifestos. Students deliberately targeted administrative buildings, transforming sterile corridors into galleries of dissent. The irony was palpable. Institutions designed to archive history were now being written on by it. Mexico City that same year tells an even darker story. At the National Autonomous University, murals of clenched fists and soaring doves spread like wildfire until the October night when government forces opened fire on protesters. After the massacre, officials whitewashed the walls, but the scars seeped back. Students repainted the slogans in secret, often in the same spots, as if the very mortar remembered. Decades later, conservators discovered layers upon layers of pigment under peeling plaster, a geological record of resistance. The university eventually stopped fighting it. Some buildings now display the original 1968 graffiti behind protective glass, acknowledging that these scars are as much a part of the institution's legacy as its Nobel laureates. Then there are the scars that never quite surface. Beijing's Tiananmen Square saw one of the most infamous crackdowns on student protesters in 1989. But unlike Paris or Mexico City, the physical marks were scrubbed away with startling efficiency. Yet absence can be its own kind of scar. The asphalt where the Goddess of Democracy statue once stood was replaced overnight. Yet for years, pedestrians avoided stepping on that exact patch, a silent consensus that some wounds lie beneath the surface. Nearby universities took a different approach. Rather than erase protest graffiti, they built over it, encasing rebellious slogans behind new walls like architectural time capsules. What makes campus scars so potent is their temporary-permanent duality. Unlike city monuments, university buildings are constantly repurposed. Classrooms become offices, dormitories get renovated, yet the protest marks persist. At UC Berkeley, where the free speech movement began, administrators once sandblasted away sit-in slogans from Sproul Hall's marble, only for students to carve them back deeper. In South Korea, Gwangju's Cheonam University still displays bullet pocks from the 1980 uprising, preserved not as memorials but as unvarnished evidence. The most fascinating detail, these scars often outlive their creators. Today's students pass beneath 1960s slogans they didn't write, inheriting rebellions they never knew. There's a haunting beauty to that continuity, proof that the anger of one generation can echo into the next, not through textbooks, but through the very walls where young minds learn to question everything. Universities may try to teach history, but sometimes history teaches back, one defiant scratch at a time. The statue of Edward Colston had stood in Bristol city centre for over a century, its bronze gaze looming over generations of citizens. But in June 2020, the monument to this 17th-century slave trader met a very different fate, ripped from its pedestal by ropes, rolled through the streets, and hurled into the harbor where Colston's ships had once docked with holds full of enslaved people. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't just the act itself, but the way the empty plinth instantly became a new kind of monument. Graffiti artists transformed the base into a canvas, painting names of those who'd suffered under the transatlantic slave trade. The scar left behind wasn't one of destruction, it was a space where history could finally be rewritten by those it had erased. This was far from an isolated incident. Across the American South, Confederate statues have met similar fates not through gradual decay but through deliberate public acts of reckoning. In Richmond, Virginia, the figure of Jefferson Davis was toppled, its face splattered with pink paint as crowds cheered. But look closer at the pedestal that remains, and you'll find something fascinating. The stone bears the ghostly outline where Davis once stood, like a shadow that refuses to fade. Preservationists debate whether to clean it or leave it as is, because that stain tells its own story. It's a scar of absence, a visual echo of the moment a community decided which memories deserved to endure. South Africa offers an even more layered example. After apartheid fell, Pretoria's Voortrekker monument, a hulking tribute to white settlers, became a battleground of symbols. Protesters splashed red paint across its steps, mimicking the blood spilled during the struggle for equality. But rather than remove these stains, officials let them weather naturally. Over time, rain and sun faded the paint into a rusty patina that now looks almost intentional, as if the monument itself is slowly absorbing the truth. Meanwhile, in Cape Town, activists projected the faces of murdered anti-apartheid activists onto colonial statues at night, turning oppressors into screens for the oppressed. These projections left no physical mark, but they altered how people saw those statues, forever proof that some scars exist in the mind as much as in the stone. What makes these modern monument alterations so powerful is their improvisational nature. Unlike the carefully planned iconoclasm of revolutions past, today's acts often unfold spontaneously, driven by collective emotion. When protesters in Belgium covered King Leopold II's statue in red paint, a reference to the millions killed in the Congo, the dripping streaks weren't neat or symbolic. They were messy, urgent, mirroring the chaos of history itself. Yet cities face a dilemma: clean these interventions away and risk erasing important dialogue, or preserve them and grapple with what that sanctifies. Some have found middle ground. In Oxford, where Cecil Rhodes' statue was removed after years of protest, the empty niche now hosts rotating artworks by contemporary African artists, a living scar that heals by transforming. Perhaps the most revealing detail lies in the tools used. In the past, defacing monuments required chisels or sledgehammers. Today's activists often use materials loaded with meaning: red paint for blood, chains for slavery, even honey to attract bees and obscure hated figures. These choices turn vandalism into symbolism, ensuring every mark carries layers of message. And that's the real shift these scars represent. They're not just about tearing down the past, but about reclaiming public space as a forum for ongoing conversation, one where the walls themselves are participants, bearing witness to society's unfinished march toward justice. Long before hashtags and viral campaigns, women fighting for equality found another way to make their voices heard: by carving them directly into the world around them. In the early 20th century, British suffragettes didn't just march, they wielded hammers and chisels, leaving scars that still resonate today. One of the most striking examples, the damage to the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, where a militant activist hid a small axe beneath her skirts and struck the ancient throne, splintering wood to protest women's exclusion from the coronation ceremony. But this wasn't mere vandalism, it was precision. The gouges aligned with where a queen's orb and scepter would rest, a symbolic demand: if kings sit here, why not queens? The strategy wasn't limited to grand gestures. In less visible corners of government buildings, inside stairwells, on the undersides of benches, suffragettes etched dates of hunger strikes or the names of jailed comrades. These hidden marks transformed mundane architecture into secret ledgers of resistance. Even the cells of Holloway Prison tell a story: scratches on walls tallying the days until release, tiny messages pressed into soap and left to harden. Unlike the bombastic slogans of male revolutionaries, these scars were intimate, almost conversational, as if the buildings themselves were being confided in. Fast forward a century, and the tradition has evolved into something louder but no less calculated. Take Dublin's Repeal the 8th murals in 2018, where entire buildings became canvases for the abortion rights movement. One particular mural, a woman's face with the words, "History will judge us," was painted directly across from the Irish Parliament, forcing lawmakers to confront it daily. When officials whitewashed it, activists repainted it within hours, this time adding a new layer, brushstrokes mimicking the hurried, defiant energy of underground abortions. The dialogue between erasure and reappearance became part of the artwork's power. Berlin offers another fascinating twist. Their feminist collective, Pussy Galore, turned construction barriers into protest art during the city's housing crisis. Their wheat-pasted images of evicted single mothers juxtaposed with luxury condos didn't just critique gentrification. They weaponized the very structures meant to shield redevelopment from public view. The temporary nature of these installations made them even more potent. Like the struggles they depicted, they existed in a constant state of precariousness, here today, painted over tomorrow. What unites these marks across time is their strategic placement. Suffragettes targeted symbols of male power, thrones, courthouses, parliament walls. Today's feminists focus on spaces where women's bodies are policed, outside abortion clinics, on university campuses, around domestic violence shelters. The medium may have shifted from chisels to spray cans, but the intent remains the same: to claim physical space in a world that's tried to render women's struggles invisible. Perhaps the most poignant detail lies in the afterlife of these scars. In Manchester, conservationists recently discovered faint suffrage slogans beneath layers of paint in the old Pankhurst Centre. Rather than restore the pristine walls, they preserved the graffiti under glass, treating it with the same reverence as medieval frescoes. That decision speaks volumes. It acknowledges that these aren't just acts of rebellion, but cultural artifacts, proof that when official histories exclude you, sometimes the only option is to write yourself into the architecture. Military architecture was designed to withstand bombs and bullets, but it proved defenseless against something far more subversive: the collective will of ordinary people refusing to accept war as inevitable. During the Vietnam era, America's draft offices became unlikely canvases for dissent. Not with grand murals or slogans, but with something far more personal: the tiny scratches left by draft cards being burned on window ledges. The heat warped the paint in peculiar, rippling patterns, each distortion a silent record of someone choosing resistance over compliance. Walk into an old post office in Detroit or Berkeley today, and you might still find these ghostly stains on the counters where young men once signed their names, then changed their minds. Across the Atlantic, the scars took on a colder, more ominous tone. In Britain and West Germany, nuclear bunkers, those grim, windowless monoliths meant to shield officials from atomic blasts, were transformed into public diaries of fear. Activists didn't just spray peace signs. They painted countdowns to imagined doomsdays, or scrawled the names of Hiroshima neighborhoods along the reinforced concrete. The starkest messages were the simplest: would you shelter here and let others burn? Etched into blast doors with wire-brushed steel. These weren't random acts of defacement. They were moral challenges carved directly into the architecture of apocalypse. What makes these anti-war scars so chilling is their intimacy. Unlike protest signs meant for cameras, these marks were often made in darkness, by hands shaking with urgency. In Denmark, sailors secretly notched submarine pens with the dates of unauthorized missile test cancellations. In Japan, the concrete walls surrounding you. Bases still bear faint impressions where Okinawan protesters pressed their bodies during sit-ins, leaving sweat and pigment in the shape of human silhouettes, a technique borrowed from Hiroshima's shadow art. The military's response only deepened their power. When East German officials sandblasted pacifist graffiti from the Berlin Wall, activists repainted it within hours, this time mixing the pigment with epoxy to resist removal. In Colorado, Air Force cadets were ordered to scrub peace symbols from missile silos, only to discover the protesters had used acid-based paint that permanently stained the steel. Every attempt to erase these marks became proof of their necessity, like a surgeon cutting away a wound only to find the scar tissue grows back thicker. Perhaps the most revealing detail lies in the timing. Many of these scars cluster around holidays or anniversaries. A nuclear storage facility in France bears a faded Nile du Mil, where protesters marked Y2K by stringing Christmas lights along the barbed wire. A veterans hospital in Chicago has a single brick engraved with the date, November 11, 1969, the day anti-war vets threw their medals over the White House fence. These weren't just protests, they were rituals turning military architecture into calendars of conscience, and that's the paradox these scars preserve. They remind us that even the most imposing fortresses are vulnerable, not to weapons, but to the quiet, relentless insistence that there must be another way. The concrete may remain, but the meaning can always be rewritten. Just ask the retired colonel in Virginia who, decades after Vietnam, found his old base's barracks wall still bearing a scratched quote from Eisenhower. "Every gun made is a theft from those who hunger." He left it there. Some scars, it seems, even commanders learn to live with. When economies crumble, the anger doesn't just vanish into spreadsheets. It erupts onto the streets and etches itself into the walls of the very institutions blamed for the crisis. In the wake of the 2008 financial collapse, something peculiar began happening to abandoned bank branches across America. Foreclosed buildings, once symbols of stability, became canvases for rage and dark humor. In Cleveland, a Chase branch's marble facade was transformed overnight into a mock tombstone, its engraved letters reading, "R.I.P. Middle Class." Over in Nevada, protesters stenciled giant auction signs on Wells Fargo windows, listing the bank's own assets as distressed properties. These weren't random acts of vandalism. They were carefully staged performances, turning financial jargon back on the bankers who'd wielded it as a weapon. Argentina's 2001 economic meltdown took this symbolism even further. In Buenos Aires, shuttered banks didn't just get graffiti, they were physically reinvented. One imposing Banco de la Nación branch became a community kitchen, its vaults now storing sacks of rice instead of pesos. The marble counters where loans were once denied became serving tables for soup kitchens. Most strikingly, the bank's original signage was left intact, a constant reminder of the building's former life as it served its new purpose. This wasn't just recycling space, it was poetic justice, turning temples of capital into shelters for capitalism's casualties. The scars left by economic crises have a unique duality. Unlike bullet holes or chiseled-off insignias, they often blend destruction with dark creativity. During Greece's debt crisis, protesters filled ATM vestibules with cement not to disable the machines, but to create absurdist sculptures titled "Solidarity Withdrawal." In Iceland, where reckless banking collapsed the entire economy, artists projected caricatures of disgraced financiers onto central bank walls, their distorted faces looming over Reykjavik like financial ghosts. These interventions weren't just about blame, they were about reclaiming narrative control, using humor and symbolism to process collective trauma. What's most revealing is how these marks evolve over time. In Ireland, where the 2008 crash hit brutally, some protest murals on bank walls were initially covered up, only to be painstakingly restored years later by local artists. The message was clear: the wounds might fade, but the lessons shouldn't. Meanwhile, in Spain, a Banco Popular branch became an unofficial memorial after its collapse, with depositors leaving photocopied bank statements like funeral offerings at its locked doors. These fragile paper scars spoke volumes, proof that financial devastation leaves marks no less real than those carved in stone. Perhaps the most poignant economic scars are the ones that never heal by design. In Detroit, the abandoned Michigan Central Station stands with its windows smashed not by vandals, but by the city itself, an intentional decision to preserve the building's 2008 appearance as a monument to industrial decline. The shattered glass catches the light at certain angles, creating a glittering warning that towers of finance are just as fragile as the people beneath them. And that's the true power of these scars. They don't just record collapse, they demand we remember who paid the price and who walked away unscathed. The scars left by indigenous land reclamation movements aren't just marks on buildings, they're brushstrokes in a much larger story of survival. In Canada, the haunting facades of former residential schools now bear vibrant murals of thunderbirds and totems, their colors clashing violently with the grim brick beneath. These aren't random acts of decoration. Every stroke carries intention. When Cree artists painted a massive red handprint across the entrance of a Manitoba school in 2018, it wasn't merely symbolism. That handprint mirrored the children's actual handmarks found pressed into the school's original mortared tiny ghosts saying, "We were here, we remember." The building, once a tool of forced assimilation, now wears its shame openly, transformed into a canvas for the very cultures it tried to erase. Australia tells a parallel story, but with a different palette. In Melbourne, the monolithic Victoria Parliament House, a bastion of colonial power, became an unlikely ally in 2020 when Wurundjeri elders were invited to etch traditional diamond python patterns into its sandstone. What seemed like reconciliation had sharper edges. The snake motif wasn't just art. In Dreamtime stories, the python shapes rivers and landscapes. By carving it into government stone, the elders weren't decorating, they were rewriting. Every groove whispered, this land was never yours to govern. Even more striking are the unofficial acts, the delicate etchedness spines scratched into Sydney's Customs House pillars by anonymous hands, or the hidden boomerang silhouettes dotting Adelaide's post office walls. These marks don't ask permission, they assert presence. The genius of these scars lies in their duality. In the U.S., when Lakota activists splashed the Black Hills with red paint across Mount Rushmore's viewing platform, the media called it vandalism. But the pigment was washable, a deliberate choice. The message wasn't about permanence, it was about visibility. The temporary stain forced tourists to literally walk through the protest, their shoes tracking crimson footsteps back to their cars. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Maori protesters used projected light to tattoo colonial statues with traditional Tomoko patterns. By dawn, the projections faded, but the images lingered in photographs and memory, a proof that reclamation doesn't always need physical marks to leave scars. What governments often misunderstand is that these acts aren't about destruction. In Ottawa, when an Algonquin artist carved a broken treaty medal into the base of a John A. Macdonald statue, she left the stone dust in a neat pile at its feet, a reference to the Indigenous remains still missing from residential school grounds. The dust, like the truth, couldn't be swept away quietly. Even the materials carry meaning: ochre from stolen earth, charcoal from ceremonial fires, crushed shells from ancestral middens mixed into paint. This isn't graffiti, it's land acknowledgement in its rawest form, turning colonial structures into unwilling witnesses. The most powerful lesson comes from the caretakers. At the former Mohawk Institute in Ontario, now a museum, staff preserve both the school's original abuse-scarred walls and the contemporary art layered over them. The result is a dialogue across time, chipped green paint spelling "help" in a child's handwriting, covered by a soaring feather mural that seems to cradle the word without erasing it. This layered approach reveals the true purpose of these architectural scars. They're not covering history, they're holding it accountable, ensuring that every future generation must confront both the wound and the healing, side by side in stone. In the shadows of oppression, queer communities have long turned architecture into both a shield and a declaration. Take Berlin's Nollendorfplatz, where a pink triangle, once sewn onto the uniforms of gay concentration camp prisoners, now blazes defiantly on the square's cobblestones, reimagined in vibrant mosaic. This isn't just public art, it's a surgical reversal of history. The same symbol that marked thousands for death now marks the neighborhood as a sanctuary, its radiant tiles catching the light where darkness once reigned. Nearby, the bricks of El Dorado, a Weimar-era queer cabaret raided by the Nazis, still bear faint grooves where patrons scratched messages into the plaster as they were dragged away. Today, those grooves are traced daily by new generations, fingertips connecting across decades in silent solidarity. The AIDS crisis etched its own scars into cityscapes. In New York's West Village, the metal fence surrounding the former St. Vincent's Hospital Ground Zero for the epidemic is tangled with thousands of handwritten memorial tags, each one a name, a date, a plea. Over time, rain and wind have faded the ink, but the indentations remain, pressed into the metal-like braille. Down in San Francisco, activists chiseled the word "remember" into the concrete base of a Market Street light pole, aligning it perfectly so the shadow spells act up at noon every World AIDS Day. These marks aren't passive memorials, they're active participants in the landscape, forcing the city to confront gaps in its memory. Some of the most powerful queer scars are the ones you have to know how to read. In mid-century America, discrete symbols guided LGBTQ+ individuals to safety. A lambda painted on a bookstore's lintel, a pair of interlocking Venus symbols scratched into a park bench. These weren't just signals, they were lifelines. London's Admiral Duncan pub, devastated by a 90s hate crime bombing, preserved a single shrapnel-marked wall behind glass. The damage wasn't cleaned or repaired. It was framed like a canvas, the pockmarks forming an unintended pattern resembling pride flag colors. Patrons now leave flowers in the craters, turning violence into an accidental altar. What makes these architectural interventions so radical is their refusal to be erased. When Moscow officials painted over a rainbow crosswalk in 2013, activists responded by staining the asphalt with colored powder that seeped back with every rain. In Uganda, where anti-homosexuality laws forced clubs underground, regulars began embedding tiny rainbow chips into sidewalk cracks outside speakeasies, visible only when sunlight hit at certain angles. Even in the most hostile environments, queer resilience finds ways to inscribe itself into the built world, ensuring that no matter how many times the surface is scrubbed, the message lingers beneath. Perhaps the most profound evolution is happening in former sites of persecution. The Stonewall Inn's bricks are now coated in layers of rainbow paint, so thick they've fossilized protest signs and candle wax from vigils. In Warsaw, a Soviet-era courthouse where same-sex couples were once sentenced has been reclaimed as a community center, its courtroom walls papered over with love letters from weddings it failed to prevent. These spaces don't just bear scars, they metabolize them, transforming pain into pigments, fear into foundation stones. Every chip of paint, every altered brick whispers the same truth, that oppression might shape a city's surface, but liberation rewrites its bones. Climate activism has redefined what it means to leave a mark, not just on stone, but on the conscience of an industry. When Extinction Rebellion activists dumped gallons of molasses-thick black paint down the steps of London's Shell headquarters in 2019, it wasn't mere vandalism. That creeping, tar-like cascade was a meticulously staged performance, mimicking the trajectory of real oil spills. Each viscous drip calculatingly slow, each splatter landing with the weight of accusation. What made this scar different? Its impermanence. The paint washed away, but the imagery lingered in headlines and social media feeds, turning a corporate facade into a temporary monument to ecological violence. This theatrical approach to scarring architecture reaches far beyond Europe. In Norway, campaigners projected melting glacier footage onto the glass walls of Statoil's offices, transforming reflective windows into screens broadcasting the company's alleged crimes. The projections left no physical trace, yet employees arriving for work found themselves walking through phantom ice sheets, a psychological scar that outlasted the light beams. Meanwhile, in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, where petrochemical plants tower over predominantly black communities, activists have taken a subtler approach. They affix weather-resistant stickers shaped like toxic emission clouds to factory fences, each one numbered with local cancer rates. These fake warning labels weaponize corporate aesthetics against the polluters themselves, using regulatory language to highlight what official signage never will. The genius of these environmental scars lies in their duality. Unlike chiseled rebellions of the past, they often employ materials that mirror the destruction they protest. In Melbourne, climate protesters used heat-sensitive paint to create vanishing Arctic ice maps on coal company walls, the artwork disappearing as temperatures rose, just like actual glaciers. In Texas, a group suspended giant fishing nets filled with plastic debris torn from the Gulf of Mexico across the entrance of an ExxonMobil building, forcing executives to literally walk through the ecological consequences of their policies. These installations function like architectural guilt trips, making abstract statistics viscerally unavoidable. Corporations retaliate with aggressive cleanups, but the activists are always one step ahead. After BP pressure washed a "oil kills" projection from their London HQ, Greenpeace responded by illuminating the building with even larger animations of drowning polar bears, this time using drones that left no surface to scrub. In Canada, where tar sands protesters were banned from approaching certain buildings, they began launching biodegradable dye capsules at night, staining corporate logos with temporary but vivid woodland green. The message was clear: you can erase the marks, but you can't erase the movement. Perhaps the most potent environmental scars are those that transform corporate spaces into classrooms. At Harvard's climate protests, students didn't just occupy administrative buildings, they turned marble lobbies into mock flood zones, marking waterline heights from actual disaster areas on the walls. In Frankfurt, activists glued scientific papers detailing Deutsche Bank's fossil fuel investments across its glittering atrium, turning the financial temple into an impromptu archive of complicity. These interventions force a collision between power and knowledge, ensuring that even when the glue dissolves or the chalk washes away, the cognitive dissonance remains. What makes these marks so revolutionary is their refusal to play by traditional rules of protest. They don't just accuse, they reimagine. A Chevron gas station in San Francisco became an accidental art gallery when activists replaced price signs with panels showing the real cost of carbon, not in dollars but in species extinction rates. A Zurich insurance giant's polished doors now bear nearly invisible laser-etched quotes from Pacific Islanders displaced by rising seas, only legible when sunlight hits at noon. These scars whisper rather than scream, proving that sometimes the most enduring marks are those that make people lean in closer, not flinch away. The ultimate lesson lies in the aftermath. When Shell tried to sue Extinction Rebellion for the paint protest, the court transcripts became part of the performance. Activists projected them onto the courthouse walls alongside live feeds of actual oil spills. It was a masterstroke. The legal system's attempt to silence dissent instead amplified it, turning courtroom rhetoric into another layer of the scar. And that's the secret power of these environmental marks. They don't just damage reputations, they reveal architectures of complicity, showing how walls meant to protect power can become mirrors reflecting its failures. During times of political tension, even the most ordinary surfaces could become pages in an invisible playbook. The Cold War saw this phenomenon reach dizzying heights, where park benches, lampposts, and brick walls transformed into covert message boards. In Havana, revolutionaries developed an ingenious system. Tiny notches along the edges of public benches corresponded to letters in the Spanish alphabet. A groove at the 30-degree position might signal a weapons drop, while a chip near the seat's corner could warn of surveillance. To the untrained eye, these were mere imperfections from weather or wear. But to those in the know, they formed a language as precise as Morse code, hidden in plain sight. This cryptographic approach wasn't unique to Cuba. Across the Iron Curtain, similar systems flourished. In East Berlin, the Stasi used subtle chalk marks on apartment door frames to flag residences of interest, a crooked line for subject under observation, a smudged dot for safe house. Meanwhile, CIA operatives in Moscow developed dead drop indicators by altering the mortar between specific bricks in public parks. A slightly recessed joint meant package delivered, while a protruding one signaled abort. The genius lay in the materials. These scars mimicked natural erosion, blending seamlessly into the urban landscape. Unlike paper notes or radio signals, they couldn't be intercepted or burned, only read by those who knew where to look. Some of the most sophisticated examples emerged from Prague, where dissidents turned Gothic architecture into their canvas. The city's ornate facades, already dense with carvings, offered perfect camouflage. A new scratch on a saint's robe might seem accidental, but its placement relative to nearby gargoyles could indicate meeting times. Even restoration work became suspect when crews repaired a chipped angel's wing onset. Vitebsk Cathedral, underground printers received the signal to change safe houses. The system was so effective because it exploited a paradox. The more decorative the building, the easier it was to hide messages. Who would notice one extra flourish among thousands? The real artistry, though, lay in the escalation protocols. In Budapest, if a coded wall scar was disturbed, say, by suspicious cleaning, activists would switch to shadow writing. They'd exploit the angle of sunlight to create temporary signals. A strategically placed dent in a windowsill would cast a shadow resembling a dagger at noon, warning of police raids. Other cells used rainwater channels, carving grooves that directed runoff to form temporary symbols on pavements after storms. These ephemeral scars were the ultimate safeguard, evidence that vanished as quickly as it appeared. What's startling is how these practices persist today, updated for the digital age. In Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, activists scratched QR codes into handrails linking to encrypted chats, a fusion of ancient tradecraft and modern tech. Belarusian opposition groups still use Soviet-era methods, etching rally coordinates into tree bark near government buildings. The tools may evolve, but the principle remains. When speech is policed, architecture becomes the ultimate silent ally. These cryptographic scars remind us that oppression breeds ingenuity, and that sometimes the most powerful messages aren't spoken or written, but quietly carved into the world around us, waiting for the right eyes to decipher them. The gates of Detroit's Fisher body plant too still bear the ghostly seams where auto workers welded them shut during the 1936 sit-down strike, not just locking out management, but physically reshaping the architecture of power. Those rough, uneven weld lines tell a story far richer than simple defiance. They reveal a meticulous strategy. By fusing the factory's entrances, workers turn the building itself into their ally, transforming Henry Ford's gleaming symbol of industrial efficiency into a fortress of collective bargaining. The genius wasn't just in the act, but in the permanence. Decades later, those scars remain, a tactile reminder that labor movements don't just pass through history, they engrave themselves into it. France's railway workers took a different but equally deliberate approach. Along the stone walls of Paris's Gare de Lyon, you'll find columns etched with dates 1947, 1995, 2020, each marking a major strike. At first glance, they resemble mundane maintenance notes, but look closer. The carvings align perfectly with sight lines from ticket counters and platforms, ensuring passengers would inevitably glimpse them. Unlike protest signs that get torn down, these marks required no upkeep. They let the infrastructure itself whisper to commuters, "We were here, we'll return." The most striking detail lies in the tools chosen. Detroit's welders used the factory's own equipment against it, literally weaponizing the means of production. French rail workers denied access to heavy machinery, improvised with pocket knives and railroad spikes, implements they could carry openly without suspicion. Both methods turned everyday objects into instruments of historical record, proving that memorials don't require marble or bronze. Sometimes all it takes is a determined hand and a surface meant to outlast the moment. Even failures left their mark. In Britain's 1984 miners' strike, pit closures prompted workers to seal colliery gates with concrete. Though Thatcher's government eventually broke the strike, the hardened plugs remained for years accidental monuments to resistance. Visitors today can still find traces where the concrete met iron, the materials fused in a desperate grip. These scars don't commemorate victory, they honor persistence, reminding us that even lost battles can reshape the physical world. What makes labor scars unique is their collaborative nature. Unlike solitary acts of protest, each mark represents countless hands. The welder who sealed the gate, the colleague who passed the torch, the hundreds who cheered as the metal cooled. In Barcelona's textile district, factory windows still bear concentric cracks from 1917, when workers hurled looms through glass in unison. The spiderweb patterns radiate outward like shared anger given form. Perhaps the most poignant examples emerge when management tries to erase these marks and fails. A Chicago meatpacking plant's repaired gate still shows a hairline shadow where strikers once chained it. A Melbourne tram depot's fresh paint can't quite obscure the 1946 strike demands bleeding through. These half-erased scars become palimpsests, proving that worker histories resist simple deletion. They linger in the grain of wood, the pockmarks of brick, the memories of metal waiting for the next generation to rediscover and reanimate them. The lesson etched into these surfaces is clear. When people unite, their struggles don't vanish when the picket lines disband. They crystallize in the very structures they sought to transform, turning factories and stations into living archives. Every welded seam, every carved date, every stubborn stain whispers the same truth, that buildings remember what textbooks often smooth over, and stone can be the most honest historian of all. When Mussolini's regime fell, the fascist architecture meant to glorify his rule didn't just crumble, it became a battleground of memory. Walk through Rome's Your District today, and you'll spot the oddest details on those stark, imposing facades. A missing fasces symbol here, a chipped Latin motto there. These aren't accidents of time. They're precise surgical strikes where partisans used chisels to excise the most overt fascist imagery while leaving the building structurally intact. The message was clear: we reject what this stood for, but we won't let the past erase itself. Some scars are so delicate they look almost reverent, like the way someone might carefully peel away a label from a jar to reuse the glass. Berlin tells a darker story. After the war, Soviet troops famously blew up the Nazi parade grounds, but it's the smaller, quieter acts that carry the real weight. In the cement of the Reichsbank steps, you can still find tiny hammer and sickle impressions pressed into the wet concrete by Red Army soldiers, not as vandalism but as a ritual. They were quite literally stamping fascism beneath their boots, turning the architecture of genocide into a ledger of victory. Nearby, the bullet holes pocking the columns of the new Reich Chancellery weren't filled in. They were outlined in white paint by East German conservators, turning each impact into a deliberate exhibit. Every crater became a caption saying, "This is what happens to tyranny." Modern anti-fascist scars have evolved into something even more subversive. In Madrid, a Franco-era monument's plinth was secretly hollowed out by activists and filled with soil from mass graves, transforming a symbol of dictatorship into an unmarked coffin for its victims. Budapest's Memento Park takes a different approach. Instead of destroying Soviet statues, they're gathered in a derelict field, their pedestals tagged with spray paint that quotes their own propaganda back at them in dripping irony. The statues still stand, but the context weaponizes them. The most powerful examples blur the line between erasure and preservation. In Naples, a fascist-era post office now houses a contemporary art museum. Its original mosaic swastikas not removed but shattered and rearranged into abstract patterns, a visual metaphor for how trauma can be remade without being forgotten. Similarly, Vienna's Aspern Nord train station left its Nazi-era eagle relief intact but mounted a mirrored panel opposite it, forcing visitors to see their own reflections superimposed over the symbol. These interventions don't just reject hate, they force it into dialogue with the present, ensuring the architecture can never return to its original meaning. What unites these scars across decades is their precision. Whether it's a 1943 partisan carving, Vergogner, shame, into a Milanese ministry steps or a 2020 protester projecting George Floyd's face onto a Confederate monument, the goal is the same: to hijack the oppressor's stage and rewrite the script in real time. The materials may change, chisels give way to projectors, hammer strikes to augmented reality, but the human impulse remains, to stand where power once stood and say, "Look closer." This story isn't finished, and that's why these scars matter. They don't just commemorate resistance, they invite us to join it, one chip in the stone at a time. The streets of locked-down cities became galleries of grief and resilience overnight, their walls absorbing the tremors of a world turned upside down. In Bergamo, Italy, the early epicenter of Europe's COVID nightmare, the side of Papa Giovanni Hospital transformed into a mosaic of post-it notes, thousands of them fluttering like fragile prayers, each scribbled with messages to nurses and doctors. Grazie per aver salvato mia madre, Siet Angeli. These weren't just thank you cards, they were tactile proof of lives hanging in the balance, stuck to brick because the weight of emotion couldn't be contained indoors. Over time, rain blurred the ink, but the stains remained ghostly imprints of words that had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, in New York's East Village, a different kind of scar appeared. As theaters shuttered and restaurants boarded up, their plywood protection became a canvas for the unheard. A masked figure in a hazmat suit danced across a storefront, spray painted in violent neon pink. Next to it, the words, "We are still here," dripped down like tears. This wasn't street art as usual. The emptiness of the streets gave each piece a haunting urgency, as if the buildings themselves were screaming into the void. Even the materials told a story. The paint was cheap, the brushes disposable, mirroring the makeshift hospitals popping up in convention centers. Some of the most poignant markings were the ones never meant to last. In Mumbai, migrant workers walking hundreds of miles home left chalk arrows on highways, guiding others to water sources or police checkpoints. These fragile signposts washed away with the monsoon, but their temporal nature made them more powerful, a reminder that crisis scars don't always need permanence to matter. Similarly, London's National Health Service hospitals became dotted with rainbow stickers in children's handwriting, stuck to windows where isolated patients could see them from their beds. The sun bleached the colors within weeks, but the sentiment lingered: "You are not alone." What makes pandemic-era scars unique is their paradoxical intimacy. Unlike revolutionary slogans carved into stone, these marks often addressed specific individuals: a nurse's name on a sidewalk in Madrid, a grocery clerk's portrait on a bus stop in Toronto. The hyper-local scale mirrored the virus's indiscriminate spread. Every scratch on glass or smear of paint felt like a breadcrumb trail through collective trauma. In Melbourne's lockdown alleys, someone stenciled "Breathe" next to fire hydrants, a dual plea for air and calm, where the act of noticing it became its own kind of communion. Then there were the scars that hid in plain sight. Seoul's subway stations sprouted cryptic red tape markings on certain benches, signals from the homeless community indicating where masks or meals could be found. In Sao Paulo, apartment windows displayed upside-down brooms, a grassroots signal for "We need help." These weren't protests, they were survival scripts written in the language of everyday objects, turning balconies and sidewalks into lifelines. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the erasures. As cities returned to normal, many quarantine murals were painted over, their messages buried under fresh coats of beige. But like pentimento in old paintings, traces seep through. A corner of a rainbow peeking from beneath corporate signage, the faint outline of a 6-foot distancing reminder under new sidewalk decals. These half-visible scars are the pandemic's true monuments, whispering that healing doesn't mean forgetting. They ask us, when the next crisis comes, will we remember how to read the walls? Digital Dissent has evolved beyond chisels and spray paint now. It flickers to life in beams of light that leave no permanent mark, yet etch themselves into collective memory. Picture this: a corporate headquarters in London suddenly illuminated not by its own lighting, but by a guerrilla projection of oil spill footage cascading down its glass facade. The images cling like spectral stains for 20 mesmerizing minutes before security scrambles to shut it down. But here's the twist: the real impact isn't the temporary display. It's the hundreds of smartphone videos instantly uploaded, turning the building's own surface into a viral billboard against its will. This is protest reimagined for the digital age, where architecture becomes both target and canvas, hijacked without ever being touched. Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement took this concept even further during the 2019 protests. Activists developed an augmented reality app that allowed anyone with a smartphone to overlay digital scars onto government buildings. Point your camera at the Legislative Council, and suddenly cracks would spiderweb across its facade, or virtual blood would drip from its columns, symbols of systemic fractures visible only through screens. These weren't just clever animations, they were deliberately layered to align with actual architectural features, making the metaphors feel eerily tangible. The brilliance lay in the duality. Authorities could scrub away physical graffiti, but the digital marks kept reappearing like ghosts only certain eyes could see. What makes these virtual scars revolutionary is their democratization of space. In Moscow, feminist collective Pussy Riot projected a giant, Rip Putin, onto the facade of the Russian Security Services building, an act that would have meant certain imprisonment if done with paint. The light show lasted 90 seconds before police arrived, but its afterlife was infinite, morphing into memes and remixes across Telegram channels. Similarly, in Minneapolis after George Floyd's murder, protesters used laser pointers to tattoo "Defund" in shimmering green across the police precinct's brickwork. Unlike spray paint, these luminous accusations couldn't be power washed away. They existed in the shared experience of those who witnessed them, then dissolved into the night, leaving no forensic trace but indelible psychological impact. The most subversive aspect, these ephemeral interventions exploit the very technology meant to suppress dissent. Facial recognition cameras can't arrest a projection. Motion sensors can't detect AR overlays. In Barcelona, activists circumvented strict anti-protest laws by using drones to project a giant "homelessness is policy" onto City Hall, the machines hovering just beyond legal airspace boundaries. The light didn't trespass, only the building's surface received the message, like a whisper only walls could hear. Yet for all their innovation, these digital scars share DNA with their physical ancestors. The pink triangle projected onto Berlin's Holocaust Memorial echoes the mosaic one at Nollendorfplatz. The AR cracks splintering Hong Kong's government buildings mirror the actual bullet holes preserved in Sarajevo. The tools may have evolved from chisels to code, but the human impulse remains unchanged, to make power confront its own reflection in the architecture it builds to intimidate. And that's the true genius of these 21st century scars. They prove that in an age of surveillance and sanitized spaces, resistance doesn't need permanence to persist, just light, creativity, and the unwavering belief that even the most imposing facades are vulnerable to illumination. The sugar plantations of Jamaica hide stories in their very foundations, stories written not in ink, but in the deliberate imperfections of brick and wood. Beneath the whitewash of great house walls, archaeologists have found strange patterns in the mortar, clusters of 3 stones arranged in triangles, or bricks slightly askew from their neighbors. To the untrained eye, they look like shoddy craftsmanship, but to the enslaved Africans who built these estates, they were something far more powerful, a coded language of resistance. These seemingly random irregularities formed maps, marking hidden paths to maroon settlements in the mountains, or signaling where weapons could be smuggled under floorboards. The genius lay in their plausibility. Overseers dismissed the oddities as lazy work, never realizing they were walking over rebellion blueprints every day. Across the Atlantic in Louisiana, the scars take on an even darker poetry. The massive cypress beams supporting plantation barns often bear faint carvings, not the initials of owners, but Congo cosmograms, West African Adinkra symbols, and coded lunar calendars. One particularly chilling example survives at Whitney Plantation, a beam notched with 28 small grooves, followed by one deep gash. Oral histories suggest it tallied the days until a planned uprising, with the final scar marking the night the revolt began. What's astonishing is the medium itself. These marks weren't made on paper or hidden in diaries. They were gouged into the very timbers that held up the slaveholders' economy, turning the infrastructure of oppression into its own undoing. Some of the most heartbreaking scars are the ones meant to outlast their creators. In South Carolina's Lowcountry, researchers discovered rice trunks floodgate mechanisms controlling irrigation with subtle modifications. Enslaved rice cultivators from Sierra Leone had altered the wood joints to fail after heavy rains, sabotaging harvests without leaving obvious evidence. The real brilliance, the adjustments mimicked termite damage, ensuring blame would fall on nature rather than people. Similarly, tobacco barns in Virginia occasionally revealed char marks strategically placed where airflow would encourage slow, undetectable fires. These weren't acts of random destruction. They were calculated strikes against the system, using the master's tools to dismantle his house, one nearly imperceptible flaw at a time. The most powerful aspect of these scars is their duality. A chipped brick in a Georgian plantation wall might look like weathering, but infrared scans have revealed ochre fingerprints pressed into the clay, a way for craftsmen to embed their identity into structures meant to erase them. At Monticello, Jefferson's vaunted Mulberry Row bears strange drill marks in the workshop foundations. Recent analysis suggests they aligned with certain stars, allowing enslaved blacksmiths to track dates for secret religious ceremonies. Even the orientation of slave cabins wasn't arbitrary. Many face east-west despite owner decrees, preserving West African spiritual traditions about ancestral connections to the rising sun. What makes these marks different from other protest scars is their required subtlety. Where suffragettes could carve slogans boldly into parliament benches, enslaved resistors had to weave their defiance into the fabric of daily life. A quilt hung to air on a fence might seem innocent, but its stitching could chart escape routes. The arrangement of sweetgrass baskets on a porch could signal safe houses. Every scratch, every off-kilter brick, every accidental weak spot in construction was a risk that could mean death if discovered, which makes their survival today all the more miraculous. Nowhere is this legacy more poignant than in the Caribbean, where former plantation hospitals sometimes bear ceiling beams scarred with medicinal symbols. Herbalists enslaved as nurses would carve tiny representations of plants into the wood, a surreptitious pharmacopoeia preserving African healing knowledge under the guise of structural beams. At Suriname's Joden Savan, one such beam displays an intricate network of grooves later identified as a map of the human circulatory system, likely used to teach anatomy despite bans on literacy. These marks didn't just resist oppression, they sustained culture, ensuring traditions could survive even when people might not. Perhaps the most revealing detail lies in what happened when emancipation came. In Barbados, newly freed people returned to plantation great houses not to burn them, but to retrieve bricks marked with ancestral symbols, carrying these scarred fragments home to incorporate into their own houses. The message was clear. What began as covert resistance could now stand openly in the sun. Today, descendants still point out certain speaking stones in family walls, silent witnesses that waited centuries for their true stories to be heard. And that's the ultimate power of these scars. They remind us that oppression may dictate what hands must build, but it can never control what those hands choose to remember. Abandoned buildings have a way of speaking not through grand declarations, but through the layers of paint, scratches, and symbols left behind by those who refuse to let urban spaces belong only to the powerful. Among the most defiant of these voices are the anarchist marks etched into forgotten walls, transforming derelict structures into living manifestos. Take Berlin's iconic Taschel's Art Squat, a bullet-riddled department store turned anarchist stronghold after the wall fell. Its graffiti wasn't just decoration. It was a territorial claim, a way for artists and activists to assert that empty buildings don't belong to absent landlords, they belong to the communities that breathe life back into them. The symbols here followed a hidden grammar, a circled, A near a doorway might signal a safe space, while crossed-out Euro signs warned against commercialization. These scars weren't just protests, they were blueprints for an alternative way of living. Squatter communities worldwide have developed their own visual languages, turning cracks in the system into canvases. In Barcelona's Can Valls, a sprawling occupied social center, the walls became a living archive of resistance. When authorities tried to evict the collective in 2014, residents reinforced the building's barricades with salvaged materials, each addition marked with stenciled dates and anarchist constellations. The scars here serve dual purposes: practical warnings about unstable structures and ideological statements about collective ownership. Even the act of repair became subversive, using broken tiles to mosaic anarchist slogans, or welding shredded metal into sculptures that doubled as barricades. This wasn't vandalism, it was urban acupuncture, repurposing neglect into something vibrant and necessary. The genius of these anarchist scars lies in their impermanence. Unlike carved stone or bronze plaques, they're designed to evolve. Copenhagen's Ungdomshuset, a squatted youth center, saw its symbols change weekly. One day a black flag mural, the next a wheat-pasted collage of eviction notices turned into protest art. When police finally raided the building, activists had already smuggled out doors and floorboards etched with decades of meeting notes and manifestos, later reassembling them in a new location. These scars migrate, refusing to be pinned down. What unsettles authorities most isn't the destruction, but the creativity. In Athens during the financial crisis, anarchists occupied the abandoned Hotel City Plaza, transforming its luxury suites into refugee housing. They didn't just spray paint walls, they rewired the plumbing, solar-paneled the roof, and turned the elevator shaft into a vertical garden, each modification marked with technical diagrams and anarchist glyphs. The building became a living counterargument to the idea that only governments or corporations can manage urban space. The most poignant anarchist scars are those that outlive their creators. Berlin's Kirpi complex, occupied since 1990, preserves layers of markings like geological strata, punk lyrics from the 90s fading beneath queer feminist collectives' neon murals, all underlain by the original East German bureaucratic stencils. The building doesn't just host rebellion, it archives it. Similarly, Amsterdam's Rankrake squat kept a wall of signatures where every resident left their mark, from anarcho-punk band stickers to delicate embroidery stretched across broken window frames. When the city finally evicted them, they held a ceremony transferring these fragments to a traveling exhibition, proving that even when buildings fall, the ideas etched into them find new homes. These scars ask a radical question: who gets to decide what a city is for? The answer, scrawled on 1,000 battered walls across Europe, is simple. Not just the powerful, but the people who live in the cracks and dare to imagine something better. And perhaps that's the ultimate power of anarchist marks. They don't just challenge ownership, they redefine it, one reclaimed brick at a time. The modern anti-colonial movement has found one of its most powerful tools not in protest signs or pamphlets, but in the vibrant strokes of street art that transform blank walls into roaring manifestos. In the Palestinian city of Ramallah, a once nondescript concrete barrier now pulses with color, a massive mural depicting an oversized key, its teeth casting shadows that shift with the sun. This isn't just decoration, it's a collective memory etched in paint. Each of the key's ridges corresponds to a village depopulated in 1948, while the shaft elongates like a timeline stretching toward return. Locals call it the Great Key, and its presence turns the wall into something far more subversive, a deed of ownership written in pigments that no bulldozer can fully erase. Puerto Rico's streets tell a parallel story through their murals. In San Juan Santos district, a colonial-era building wears a new skin, a kaleidoscopic portrait of Lolita Lebron, the nationalist leader who stormed the U.S. Capitol in 1954. The artist, a collective called La Puerta, embedded crushed seashells into the paint, a nod to the Taino ancestors who first resisted colonization. What makes this scar different is its interactive nature. Viewers who touch the mural's border trigger hidden speakers playing Lebron's courtroom speech. Here, architecture doesn't just speak, it listens and responds, turning passive observation into confrontation. The brilliance of these contemporary scars lies in their layered meanings. In Belfast, Republican neighborhoods have repurposed colonial-era brickwork into canvases for Celtic knot murals. At first glance, the interwoven patterns seem purely decorative. But look closer, the knots incorporate barbed wire motifs, their twists forming hidden maps of pre-partition land boundaries. Similarly, in Cape Town's District 6, artists use augmented reality to restore demolished homes via smartphone overlays. Point your camera at a parking lot, and suddenly the pavement flickers with projections of the vibrant community raised under apartheid. These scars don't just protest, they resurrect. Yet the most potent anti-colonial art often thrives in legality's gray zones. When Hong Kong protesters painted Lennon walls with demands for democracy, authorities' power washed them daily. The response, artists switched to biodegradable pigments mixed with wildflower seeds, each cleanup inadvertently planting the next generation of dissent. In Western Sahara, occupied by Morocco, activists project Sahrawi independence symbols onto Spanish colonial buildings using mirrors to catch sunlight, creating luminous protests that vanish before police can intervene. These ephemeral scars prove that permanence isn't necessary for impact. Sometimes the most powerful marks are those that force power to chase shadows. What unites these global movements is their reclamation of visual language. The Maori artist collective in Aotearoa, New Zealand, paints traditional koru patterns over British colonial statues, not to deface them, but to reclothe them in indigenous identity. In Haiti, the walls of Port-au-Prince's gingerbread houses bloom with Vive symbols, turning French colonial architecture into vessels for Vodou spirituality. Each stroke of paint, each pixel of light, each embedded seashell whispers the same truth. That liberation isn't just political, it's aesthetic, spiritual, and etched into the very surfaces that once symbolized oppression. The ultimate power of these modern scars, they refuse to let history fossilize. When Dublin's Georgian Quarter, built on wealth from Caribbean slavery, became a canvas for African-Irish artists, the murals didn't just critique the past, they renegotiated the present. One particularly striking work layers slave ship diagrams beneath portraits of contemporary Black Irish poets, their verses woven into the rigging like sails catching the wind. This is anti-colonial art at its most transformative, not erasing architecture's painful legacy, but composting it into something fertile, where new stories can take root. There's a profound difference between wounds that heal and wounds we choose to keep open, not out of neglect but out of reverence. In Lower Manhattan, the footprints of the Twin Towers stand as gaping voids, their sheer walls descending into reflecting pools where the buildings once rose. This isn't absence, it's sacred geometry. The designer, Michael Arad, didn't just remove rubble, he inverted the towers, turning their outlines into vessels that catch rain, light, and the names of the lost etched into bronze parapets. The genius lies in what's missing. The scars aren't filled with new structures, but with water that mirrors the sky, as if grief itself has become part of the architecture's DNA. Visitors don't just see the memorial, they feel its hollowness underfoot, a physical echo of the unimaginable loss. Japan's approach to tsunami scars reveals a different kind of wisdom. In Rikuzentakata, a single pine tree survived the 2011 disaster where 70,000 others fell. When saltwater eventually claimed its roots, the community didn't replace it. They painstakingly preserved the skeleton, reinforcing its brittle trunk with carbon rods until it stood like a ghostly sentinel overlooking the rebuilt town. Nearby, concrete foundations of obliterated homes were left exactly where the waves deposited them, their jagged edges now framing educational plaques. These aren't ruins, they're time machines, forcing every new seawall and evacuation route to be measured against the evidence of what the water can do. What sets memorial scars apart is their refusal to soften with time. In Oklahoma City, the empty chairs on the bombing site aren't arranged neatly, some cluster tightly, others sit apart, mirroring where victims were standing when the blast hit. The smaller chairs for children are almost unbearable to confront, their sizes calculated from school records. This is grief made tangible, where architecture doesn't just commemorate but reconstructs the moment itself. Similarly, Berlin's Stolperstein bronze cobblestones marking Holocaust victims' last homes aren't placed conveniently to the side. They're embedded directly in sidewalks, forcing pedestrians to literally trip over memory. The discomfort is the point. The most powerful memorial scars often emerge from community insistence rather than official plans. In Chile's Villa Grimaldi, a former torture center, survivors rejected government proposals for a polished monument. Instead, they planted a rose garden amid the exposed interrogation cells, each variety chosen by a survivor to represent someone lost. The thorns aren't hidden, they're part of the lesson. Likewise, in Argentina's ESMA Museum, the military's maternity ward where prisoners gave birth before being disappeared was preserved exactly as found, down to the peeling wallpaper. Conservators even left the faint pencil marks where mothers measured their children's growth, turning the walls into living testimony. These scars share an unshakable truth that healing doesn't require erasure. When a 2020 wildfire vaporized the town of Paradise, California, residents embedded melted car keys and warped street signs into new construction, ensuring the fire's fingerprints would remain visible in the rebirth. In New Orleans, Katrina's waterlines weren't painted over but framed with plaques quoting survivors' stories at that exact height. The lesson echoes across continents, from the bullet-pocked facades of Sarajevo's libraries to the intentionally unrepaired cracks in Christchurch's earthquake-damaged cathedral. These marks don't just say, "never forget," they whisper, "never let the world forget." And in that refusal to smooth over the past lies their extraordinary power, not as wounds but as witnesses. Concrete doesn't just divide land, it collects stories. Along the U.S.-Mexico border, the towering steel bollards of the barrier stretch into the distance, their surfaces transformed into a sprawling, uncurated gallery of human experience. Here, the rust-streaked metal wears layers of paint depicting everything from cartoonish skulls to delicate butterflies, each image a voice insisting, "We were here." Among the most haunting are the children's drawing stick figure families holding hands, sons with smiling faces, houses with exaggerated doors, scrawled at heights that suggest small hands were lifted up to reach the canvas. These aren't random doodles, they're artifacts of interrupted childhoods, left by minors who may have crossed the border alone or been separated from parents. The contrast couldn't be starker. A wall designed to repel becomes a surface that absorbs hope, fear, and memory in equal measure. Cross to the Moroccan side of the Melilla border fence, and the scars take on a different texture. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, stranded for months or years in makeshift camps, have woven strands of fabric and plastic into the razor-wire, colorful threads that flutter like prayer flags in the wind. Some patches resemble traditional weaving patterns from Mali or Senegal, tactile reminders of homes left behind. Others form crude ladders, diagrams of attempted escapes frozen in yarn. The fence's very architecture, meant to slice skin, has been subverted into a communal loom where every knot and braid whispers defiance. What makes these border scars unique is their impermanence. Unlike carved stone or chiseled marble, they exist in a constant cycle of erasure and renewal. U.S. Border Patrol routinely paints over sections of the barrier, only for new art to bloom within days. In Croatia, where migrants traverse the Balkan route, officials pressure wash away Arabic poetry scrawled on border posts, unaware that the water often deepens the stains, making the words more legible. This push and pull transforms the walls into living documents, their surfaces palimpsests of resilience. The most potent marks aren't always visual. Along the Evros River between Turkey and Greece, asylum seekers have tied handwritten notes to tree branches, letters soaked by rain, their ink bleeding into the bark. Some contain GPS coordinates of drowned loved ones, others recipes for dishes they'll never cook again. The riverbank has become an accidental archive where even the act of writing is a gamble against the elements. These scars refuse to let borders be abstractions. When you stand before a section of wall in Tijuana, etched with the names of desaparecidos, migrants vanished en route, the structure ceases to be political rhetoric. It becomes a grave marker without a grave, a ledger of the missing written in stolen moments. Similarly, the Hungarian border's railway tracks where Syrian refugees once walked, now bear scratched arrows pointing north, left by those who made it through for those still coming. Perhaps the most subversive aspect is how these interventions repurpose the tools of exclusion. In Palestine, tear gas canisters fired at protesters are collected, polished, and reshaped into art, supplies their hollow casings becoming pens to draw on the separation barrier. At the Poland-Belarus crossing, migrants heat spoons over campfires to bend the metal into tiny sculptures, which they hang on the border fence like metallic moss. Even the most dehumanizing infrastructure can't resist being remade into something tender. These scars don't just document movement, they challenge the very idea of immovable boundaries. A single heart carved into the steel at San Diego's Friendship Park spans the exact line where the wall dips into the Pacific. Its halves aligned perfectly when viewed from the Mexican side, but jarringly offset from the U.S. The optical illusion is a masterclass in perspective. What looks like division from one angle becomes unity from another, and that's the secret language of border art. It reminds us that walls, no matter how thick, are never just barriers, they're mirrors, reflecting back whatever we choose to see. Utopian visions often leave behind the most haunting scars, not because they fail, but because they reveal just how close humanity came to something extraordinary. Take India's Auroville, a city dreamed up in the 1960s as a laboratory for human unity. Its central structure, the Matrimandir, rises like a golden sphere from the earth, its flawless geometry intended to symbolize perfect harmony. But wander its outskirts and you'll find the skeletons of unfinished domes, their steel ribs rusting in the salt air. These aren't ruins, they're frozen moments of belief, where concrete and rebar surrendered to monsoons, bureaucracy, or the sheer weight of idealism. The cracks in Auroville's pavements tell a quiet truth that even the most beautiful ideas must negotiate with gravity, weather, and human nature. Across the Atlantic, another ghost of utopia lingers in the Arizona desert. Arcosanti, Paolo Solery's vision for a self-sustaining arcology, was meant to house 5,000 people in a single, soaring structure. Today, only a fraction of the blueprint was realized, a cluster of concrete apses where wind chimes made from recycled ceramics still sing in the desert wind. The scars here aren't just the unfinished towers, they're the meticulous models in the workshop showing a city that never grew beyond miniature, yet something unexpected happened. The very incompleteness became part of its legacy. Visitors don't come to see a perfected utopia, but to witness the raw process of trying, the mortar joints where hands pressed "what if" into every groove. The former Soviet bloc offers a darker variation on this theme. Bulgaria's Buzlaja monument, a flying saucer-like structure built to celebrate communism, now stands with its red star shattered and its mosaics of heroic workers peeling away. What makes this scar unique is its duality. The building was both a symbol of utopian fervor and a warning about the fragility of imposed ideals. The local government once proposed demolishing it, but artists intervened, arguing that its decay was the most honest monument of all. Now, the dripping concrete and exposed rebar serve as a canvas for light projections that reinterpret its original propaganda, turning a failed relic into a living critique. Perhaps the most poignant utopian scars are the ones that never made it off the page. In 1930s America, hundreds of Depression-era homesteads were planned as cooperative farming communities, Franklin Roosevelt's answer to rural poverty. Many never progressed beyond surveyor's stakes, their boundaries now just faint lines in overgrown fields. But occasionally, you'll stumble upon a lone chimney or a set of concrete steps leading nowhere, the bones of a house that was meant to anchor a new way of living. These fragments ask a difficult question. Is it more tragic to build a utopia that fails or to never build it at all? The lesson hidden in these half-realized dreams isn't about the inevitability of failure. It's about the stubborn beauty of the attempt. In Scotland, the Findhorn Ecovillage's earliest barrel houses, dwellings built from upcycled whiskey casks, still stand decades later, their tarred staves warped by coastal winds. They were meant to be temporary, yet outlasted grander schemes. Similarly, Brazil's Brasilia, a city designed from scratch to embody modernist perfection, now thrives precisely where it deviated from the blueprint, in the favelas that grew organically around its edges. These scars whisper that utopia isn't a destination, but a compass. And sometimes the most enduring mark a vision can leave isn't a perfect structure, but the space where reality and idealism collide, a scar that keeps the conversation alive. Corporate headquarters might gleam with polished glass and brushed steel, but hidden in their pristine corridors are marks left by those who know too much. In Silicon Valley, where non-disclosure agreements are thicker than employee handbooks, dissent finds its way into the architecture itself. Engineers at a major tech giant once replaced the standard exit signs with custom LED panels that, when viewed through a phone camera, revealed lines of code exposing planned privacy violations. The sign stayed up for weeks before anyone in management noticed, plenty of time for employees to snap photos and spread the truth like digital wildfire. These insider scars often follow an unspoken visual language. A server room's cooling vents might bear tiny scratches arranged in binary patterns, encoding the dates of unethical data experiments. Elevator inspection stickers sometimes carry miniature doodles in the margins, a frowny face next to a product manager's initials, or a tiny rocket ship pointing to blacked-out text. To the untrained eye, they're meaningless, but to fellow employees, they're red flags whispering, "Don't trust this project." Some of the most damning marks aren't even physical. Disillusioned developers have been known to manipulate office lighting systems so that certain conference rooms flicker in Morse code during sensitive meetings. Others reprogram smart whiteboards to auto-censor buzzwords tied to layoffs or unethical practices, forcing executives to awkwardly dance around the omissions. The brilliance lies in the plausible deniability, after all. Who's going to accuse an LED panel of whistleblowing? financial districts have their own version of this subterfuge. Wall Street analysts once discovered that the marble floors of a major investment bank concealed a startling pattern. Tiles near the compliance office were ever so slightly darker, their polish worn down by employees who'd lingered there weighing moral dilemmas. Over in London, a trader facing pressure to manipulate rates scratched the LIBOR formula into a bathroom stall with a paperclip, a crude but effective way to ensure the math couldn't be forgotten or fudged. The most poignant corporate scars emerge when silence is weaponized. At an automotive company covering up emissions fraud, factory workers began leaving certain bolts deliberately untightened, not enough to cause danger, but enough to trigger quality control delays that stalled shipments. Each rejected vehicle became a breadcrumb trail leading back to the truth. Similarly, pharmaceutical lab technicians have been caught subtly altering calibration stickers on equipment, ensuring flawed test results would eventually be caught by regulators. What makes these marks different from ordinary sabotage is their precision. They're not acts of chaos, but of calculated correction, the equivalent of a surgeon leaving a single stitch untied so infection can drain. And like all the best scars, they tell a story that outlasts the moment. When that Silicon Valley office was finally renovated, contractors found letters scratched inside the walls where Ethernet cables ran. Names of employees who'd protested illegal data collection, sealed away but not forgotten. The building, it turns out, was keeping receipts. Perhaps the ultimate irony, many companies now pay top dollar to preserve these very scars. That flickering conference room became a stop on the new higher ethics tour. The LIBOR stall was removed whole and donated to a financial watchdog museum. Even the most controlled environments can't sterilize conscience, and sometimes the marks meant to warn become the ones worth remembering. Imagine a skyscraper in Dubai, its mirrored facade suddenly flickering with digital flames, not real fire, but a climate protest hijacking the building's own LED lighting system to project scorched earth imagery across its surface. This is the next frontier of architectural scars, not just etched in stone, but coded into the very infrastructure meant to intimidate. As technology races forward, so too do the tools of dissent. Activists now experiment with biodegradable smart paints that change color when exposed to greenhouse gases, turning corporate headquarters into real-time pollution dashboards. In Seoul, a guerrilla art collective recently hacked a billboard to display AI-generated faces of climate refugees. Their features algorithmically aged to show what children in flood zones might look like by 2050. The display lasted 17 minutes before authorities shut it down, but the images had already seared themselves into public consciousness. The rise of augmented reality adds another layer to this evolving language. Future protesters might carry no spray cans or chisels, just smartphones that overlay digital scars onto physical buildings. Picture walking past a bank and seeing your screen reveal virtual cracks spreading across its foundation, each fracture tagged with data about fossil fuel investments. These marks would be invisible to the naked eye, but inescapable for anyone with a device, creating a parallel cityscape where every structure tells its hidden story. Already, collectives are geotagging buildings with hidden histories. Scan a bland government office, and your phone might show it pulsing with archival footage of protests that once surged at its doors. But technology cuts both ways. As quickly as activists develop new methods, authorities deploy countermeasures. Facial recognition cameras now detect not just individuals, but specific graffiti styles, predicting where and when protest art might appear. Some cities have started using anti-graffiti coatings that react with airborne pigments to neutralize them chemically, a high-tech eraser for inconvenient truths. In response, dissidents are turning to ephemeral materials, ice sculptures that melt into slogans on courthouse steps, or pollen-based street art that blooms briefly before dissolving into the wind. The battle for public space is becoming a game of digital cat and mouse, where the most powerful scars might be those that flicker into existence just long enough to be remembered, then vanish before they can be censored. Yet amid all this innovation, the oldest forms of resistance persist. In Lisbon, elderly housing activists still chip away at gentrified buildings with hand tools, leaving deliberate imperfections that whisper, "This was once a home." In Jakarta, fishermen press thumbprints into wet concrete at luxury waterfront developments, ensuring their claim to the land endures even as towers rise around them. There's a profound tension here between high-tech dissent and tactile rebellion, between marks meant to go viral and those meant to endure centuries. What unites these future scars, whether digital or physical, is their insistence on truth-telling. A Berlin collective recently projected prison blueprints onto the exterior of a new Amazon warehouse, drawing uncomfortable parallels between labor conditions past and present. In Sao Paulo, hackers transformed ATMs into poetry dispensers, spitting out verses about income inequality instead of cash. These interventions don't just protest, they reprogram, however briefly, the narratives embedded in our cities. The ultimate test will be whether these next-generation scars can achieve what their predecessors did, outlast the moment that created them. The bullet holes in Sarajevo's libraries still speak decades later. Will a QR code linking to a 2035 protest video still be scannable in 2090? Can an algorithmically generated mural carry the same weight as a suffragette's chisel marks in Westminster? The answers lie in our collective willingness to keep listening to what walls, real or virtual, have always tried to tell us. That architecture isn't just where power resides, but where it's perpetually challenged, one defiant mark at a time. From ancient defacements to digital protests, ceremonial scars on architecture are more than vandalism. They're a language of resistance. Each mark tells a story of struggle, hope, and the enduring human spirit. Next time you walk past a scarred wall, pause and listen. It might just whisper secrets of the past and warnings for the future. These architectural scars are like punctuation marks in the story of humanity, bold exclamations of rebellion, quiet ellipses of grief, or underlined phrases demanding justice. They reveal the raw, unfiltered voices of people who refused to be silenced, whether they were chiseling away a tyrant's insignia or projecting a protest onto a corporate facade. What's astonishing is how universal this language is. A gouge in a medieval cathedral and a flickering QR code on a modern bank might seem worlds apart, but they share the same DNA, the unshakable need to say, "We were here. We mattered." Think about the layers of meaning packed into these marks. A single scratch on a prison cell wall isn't just damage, it's a lifeline thrown across time, connecting the hands that made it to the hands that trace it decades later. A faded slogan on a university building isn't just pain, it's a baton passed between generations, urging today's students to keep questioning, keep pushing. Even the most ephemeral scars, like a chalk arrow on a highway or a biodegradable pigment on glass, carry weight. They remind us that resistance isn't always about permanence. Sometimes it's about presence showing up, leaving a mark, and trusting that others will pick up the thread. What's equally fascinating is how these scars evolve. The tools change from chisels to drones, from soot to smart paint, but the impulse remains. A Babylonian brick stamped with a slave's fingerprint and a hacked billboard flashing climate data are part of the same continuum. Both say, look closer. The official story isn't the only one, and that's why authorities often fear these marks more than speeches or petitions. You can arrest a protester, but how do you arrest a shadow, a stain, a line of code that won't stop running? This brings us to the quiet power of noticing. You don't need to be a historian to read these scars, just curious. That chip in a statue's pedestal, maybe it's where a revolution began. That odd symbol on a park bench could be a century-old signal for sanctuary. Cities are palimpsests, and every layer has something to say. The real magic happens when we slow down enough to listen. So here's the challenge. Keep your eyes open. The next time you pass a building with an odd mark, a patch of mismatched brick, or a mural that seems out of place, stop. Ask what story it's telling, because these scars aren't just about the past, they're blueprints for the future. They show us that change isn't just possible, it's already etched into the world around us, waiting to be seen. If this journey through hidden history intrigued you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What scars have you noticed in your city? Let's keep the conversation alive, and who knows? Maybe one day, your observations will become part of the